of rare excellence, a novel of strong contemporary national significance. The Chicago Tribune. Astonishing. Time Magazine. Overflowing with life. Boston Herald. Marvelous. New York Times. It's always interesting to analyze a piece of literature that has received such widespread critical acclaim. Not that this novel has been without its critics, but I think it's safe to say that in general it's held in very high esteem. It's been lavished with praise for decades, and it certainly occupies quite a privileged position in the American literary canon. So, let's see what all the fuss is about. Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. So let's do a quick review, as usual, before we get into the politics. So I read this when I was in school, I'm sure like a lot of people, and I remember thinking that it was pretty good. So I was really looking forward to a reread and hopefully being able to appreciate it a little bit more. And to be honest, overall, after reading it, I was left very disappointed. So I really enjoyed the start of the book. Scout is an entertaining narrator. She's a wry observer of people and goings-on. And the beginning, with her going to school and everything, is funny, it's engaging, and it's well written. Then I would say before you're even 100 pages in, it starts to get a little dull. And then when the heavy drama comes later in the book, it goes off the rails a bit for me. It becomes a bit incoherent, both narratively and thematically. So as a coming-of-age story, I would say it still ends up being pretty decent overall, just a bit long-winded and tedious in parts. There is some good stuff in there about childhood and parenthood and growing up, really universal stuff that is well observed and entertaining. But the problem for me is that Scout's life and the town of Macomb, Alabama, while they're well described, are just not that captivating. So that's the novel as a story, but as a fable, let's say, thematically, morally, politically, and that is the aspect from which this book is consumed for the most part, and why it has become so renowned. From that point of view, I think the book has a lot of issues, and we'll get into that later when we talk about the politics. So in terms of the plot, the thing is that the main event of the book, which is the trial, only takes up a few chapters. There's a bit of indirect build-up to it for a while, and then there's barely anything in its aftermath. So for the majority of the novel, there isn't really a plot. It's just Scout's day-to-day life in rural 1930s Alabama, which I didn't find very interesting for the most part. And to be honest, when you get to the trial itself, I would say it isn't presented that well. There's not really a lot of drama or intrigue. The pacing of the novel in general is very slow, and it becomes more of an issue as the book drags on. Let's look at some of the major characters in the novel. Scout is the narrator, and I like her as a character. I think her voice is one of the strongest elements of the book. She is feisty, opinionated, intelligent. She's a bit of a tomboy, and it's funny seeing her spurn all of the typical feminine behavior that's expected of her. She struggles to understand a lot of the social codes that pervade rural small-town life at this time. And I think Lee does a good job of often showing Scout as the one who is being logical or empathetic, and certain adults as the ones acting unreasonably. So the events of the novel chart Scout's first conscious encounter with prejudice, and she reacts to that with the help and guidance of her father in a way that is admirable and human and touching in parts, even if her development as a character is a little bit lacking because of the superficial treatment of the themes, and we'll talk more about that later. Then we have Jem, who is Scout's older brother. He is a solid character. He can be a little bit annoying, but that's kind of the point because we're seeing him through his younger sister's eyes. And she often gets exasperated with how he tries to control her or how seriously he takes himself. I think it's a good depiction of a sibling relationship as the older one matures and moves toward adolescence and away from childish things. Jem reacts more angrily than Scout to the injustice in the novel. Even though Scout has more of a temper, Jem is definitely the more sensitive of the two in a lot of ways. And that contrast is a really interesting dynamic between them. There's also very clearly a lot of love and affection and respect between them, which is borne out in the events at the end of the novel. Then we come to Atticus Finch, Scout and Jem's father. He is the lawyer who defends Tom Robinson in the trial that is central to the book. I think people who like the character of Atticus will probably like the book in general. He's the embodiment of the moral message. He's the ethical heartbeat of the book. I did not like him as a character. He's a great father, clearly, and he's a good man in many ways. But I found his moralizing very condescending, and I also just disagree with a lot of his conclusions when it comes to morality and ethics. And we'll get into the character of Atticus in a lot more detail later when we talk about morality. Then there are a few other fairly minor characters. We have Aunt Alexandra, this kind of stuffy matriarch figure. She comes to lend Atticus a hand and live with them and try to impose some kind of feminine values on Scout, and that doesn't really work. She's an irritating character, but I guess she's supposed to be. Then we have Dill, the funny little fella who comes to Maycomb in the summer and plays with Jem and Scout. He's quite a charming character, and his story has a bit of sadness as well with his family situation, which is in stark contrast to Jem and Scout, who are so well looked after by their father. Then we have the reclusive neighbour, Boo Radley, who attracts so much of the children's attention. He's not much of a fleshed out character, really. His presence in the story is more metaphorical, for the most part, representing innocence and the power of malicious rumour. And he's really just a metaphor through which Scout learns about respecting people's wishes, not judging people by their reputation, and so on. To be honest, I didn't really care for any of the Boo Radley scenes in the novel. I found it all a bit tedious. Then finally we have the book's two major black characters, and I do think it's appropriate, unfortunately, to come to these at the end of the list, given how these characters are written. So we have Calpurnia, who is the Finch family's domestic servant, and then we have Tom Robinson, who is the accused in the trial. And to be honest, I think given how they're presented by Lee in the novel, they barely qualify as characters. They are really just props that exist to help the white characters in the story learn certain lessons. So I'm going to talk in more detail about those two and Lee's treatment of black characters in general in a minute when we talk about race. Let's talk about the writing. I think Lee's prose is very good overall, and it's one of the book's strong points. The story is eloquently told, and there are some really nice passages in there. She can write a funny or an interesting scene very well, although I think when the serious drama comes along, she doesn't portray it quite so easily, and that is definitely one area where the novel falters. Some of the later scenes are a bit clunky, a bit heavy-handed. The dialogue is pretty good overall, maybe a bit repetitive at times, or perhaps just quite uniform among a lot of the characters, which can make things quite dry. Lee certainly brings the town of Maycomb to life with her descriptions. It's a really well realized world that she builds, and all very realistically told through the eyes of a child. Whether it's a creepy abandoned house, or the games that the children play together, or the various interactions with the adults in the town, Scout's voice is strong, consistent, and believable throughout, which is very good writing. Lee is particularly skilled at capturing the essence of some of the characters we meet with just a few lines about them. How they look, how they carry themselves, Scout's impressions of them. Here's a nice example from when we meet Dill for the first time. Dill was a curiosity. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken. His laugh was sudden and happy. He habitually pulled at a cowlick in the center of his forehead. She's also good at crafting these punchy, short sentences, a lot of which work as little nuggets of morality or life lessons. Now, some of these epigrams are maybe a bit reductive or sentimental, but I do think they are a major reason for the book's enduring popularity. And we will talk about that idea more critically later, that the book contains a rather simple and unchallenging moral instruction. But anyway, here are a few examples. Atticus told me to delete the adjectives, and I'd have the facts. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. People generally see what they look for, and hear what they listen for. I think there's just one kind of folks. Folks, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. So yeah, it's all a bit fridge magnet wisdom, you know, a bit Forrest Gump for my tastes. If we talk about the tone, I think like most elements of the book, it starts off very well and then kind of deteriorates. For the first few chapters, the tone is wry, playful, charming. Scout's voice is warm and endearing, and there's a lot of humor. But then around the midpoint, it definitely starts to struggle. When the plot starts to drag, that playfulness is definitely diminished. And when the serious racial stuff comes into play, or when Scout is talking about some of the poorer families in town, for example, in those moments the tone can come across as just saccharine or downright patronizing. The end of the book manages to be both downbeat and quite mawkish and pretty dull also. The novel is a bit of a mess tonally, to be honest, which is a shame because it does start off so well. So that's it for the little review. Let's jump into the politics of the novel. We'll start by talking about race and prejudice. So the thing that this book is most famous for, I would say, is addressing racial injustice. So I think the most pertinent question to ask is, how does it do that? And I would say it does it in a way that is not just ineffective, insufficient and misguided, but also in a way that ends up being racist. There is not really any other way to say it. I think To Kill a Mockingbird is a racist novel in the way that it presents black people. And it's racist in a way that is quite lazy, and that is also quite specious in that it reads like a book that is wholly convinced, incorrectly, of its own righteousness. There is a certain type of insipid, performative liberalism that is very common among certain privileged people. Liberalism that more or less accepts, even embraces, the status quo, but that is sprinkled with a patina of banal, progressive rhetoric. Many of the politicians of the US Democratic Party, for example, have this hollow pretense at disgruntlement about injustice down to a fine art. And I think To Kill a Mockingbird is a perfect novel for those kinds of people, for them to read and cherish and rave about and recommend to people and hold up as being formative and important and significant and morally good and all that stuff. Harper Lee's novel is limited to a white perspective. Its treatment of racism is superficial, facile and patronizing. It indulges in a lot of stereotypes and caricatures. It doesn't get into the details. It doesn't demand material change. It isn't angry enough. It's too satisfied with itself. And I think that reading this book as a moral fable and enjoying it as such is a very comfortable and unchallenging way for certain people to feel self-righteous, to feel anti-racist, to feel vindicated in their rather vapid moral attitudes. It is also, I think, a text that allows certain people to close off in their minds that period of history as very much belonging to the past, to a world that no longer exists, and that enables them to feel good about all the social progress that has been made, ignoring the fact that these issues are still endemic in the US. Living in the US means reconciling yourself with a country of pervasive, inherent and seemingly indelible racism. This is a country that was founded as a racist project in murder and land theft. Racial inequality in the US is visceral. It's materially measurable. It's codified. It's deep-rooted. It is stitched into the fabric of the stars and stripes. The country has only in very recent history begun to move towards justice, and there is a long way to go. Every system and institution of the US is still steeped in racism, dripping with it. And this book does not really reckon with any of that in anything other than a glib, offhand way that itself ends up betraying this innate American racial inequality. So let's look at some examples. Calpurnia is a paper-thin character who essentially embodies the old mammy stereotype. When we see her take the Finch children to her church, she is shown to be a lot more cultured and intelligent than her peers. And I don't really know any other way to read that other than she's one of the good ones because she works for white people, because she's been allowed into the heart of a white family to serve them. And she has been educated and domesticated, basically. So yeah, that's Problematic. Then we have Tom Robinson, the man who is falsely accused of rape by a white woman, and he is depicted as incredibly simple, gullible, ignorant, just plain stupid, really. He definitely has that childish, noble, savage trope going on. This is not a man that we're supposed to feel empathy for as a human. It's more a kind of condescending pity that's being evoked. And we see this trope quite a lot. If you think about something like The Green Mile, and there are plenty of other examples as well, you have this kind of big, scary black man who is rendered impotent by something like low intelligence or a childish nature. And in this way, he's made into more of a safe and palatable character for white people to pity, as opposed to a more confident black man, for example, who might come off as a bit aggressive for certain people. And this brings us to Harper Lee's depiction of black people in general in the novel, framed by the metaphor that gives the book its title. Lee, through Atticus and through the way that she writes the black townspeople, compares them to mockingbirds. Mockingbirds are harmless animals who sing. We can enjoy their singing and we should leave them alone. There's no need to be cruel to them. They're just little old defenseless animals. And I just find something quite insulting in that metaphor. The animal, the noble savage, the child, these characters aren't given any depth or complexity. They are passive, weak, and incompetent. They are lesser beings and they should be pitied. A lot of early abolitionists shared this attitude, that black people were inferior, but that they should be in some way protected, but still remain very much segregated, very much apart from cultured, intelligent white people. The black people in this book have no agency. They don't resist. They don't even have opinions about their own situation. One of the most pernicious ideas that Lee seems to present us with is that both Calpurnia and Tom are only worthy of the pity of white people because they are respectable. They speak nicely to white people. They act respectfully. They do what's asked of them. They know their place. And they have to be saved by righteous white people like Atticus, who himself says things like, "There's nothing more sickening to me than a low-grade white man who'll take advantage of a Negro's ignorance." And Atticus is definitely depicted as a white savior in this novel. And we'll talk a bit more about Atticus's views and his moral code a little bit later. So the fact that the white savior Atticus doesn't actually save Tom, I think, is only really noteworthy in terms of the book's attempt at realism. You know, the idea that one good white man can't actually make a difference. But the fact remains that the narrative is completely centered on the white experience exclusively. We are told the story through the eyes of a young white girl. There are no prominent black characters with any kind of agency. They are simply used as instructional tools for the moral edification of the white girl. And there's no examination of the impact of any of this racial injustice or the trial or anything on the black community. Now, a few caveats. Harper Lee was white. She grew up in the South and she experienced all of this from a white person's perspective. So we can't blame her for not being James Baldwin, for example. She is entitled to write what she wants and to write what she knows and to write from her own experience. But crucially, if she decides to tackle this subject, then she is responsible for how she portrays the victims of racism. And the way that she presents them is lazy and offensive and a little racist, in my view. I think that is a legitimate criticism. Some people might say, well, she wrote the book in 1960, that's before the Civil Rights Act, etc. It's a long time ago. Yeah, I don't really buy that. 1860, you might have a point. By 1960, she should have done better. And it is completely appropriate, in my opinion, to criticize how she presents the black characters. Now, finally, I would also say that it's not Harper Lee's fault that this book has become kind of the quintessential text about race in the US. I think this is a very useful novel that tells us a lot about the white perspective at the time. And of course, it can be read as one small part of the social and cultural canon, and it should be examined critically. And then obviously, we should also be reading books by black authors like Toni Morrison and Mildred D. Taylor and so on. But I think it does say a lot about the US that a book that is so benign, so unchallenging, so white-centered has achieved that place of prestige. Something more radical or more honest, something angrier, something centering the black community, something giving the black experience and looking unflinchingly at the scale and vigor and persistence of American racism. Well, I guess that might be a bit too uncomfortable for certain people. Let's move on and talk about class and social inequality. Now, obviously the class divide in the US is often seen exclusively through the lens of race. But we also have some other class divisions that come up in the novel. When Jem has been thinking about the different groups of people in Maycomb, he tells Scout, there's 4 kinds of folks in the world. There's the ordinary kind, like us and the neighbours. There's the kind like the Cunninghams out in the woods, the kind like the Ewells down at the dump, and the Negroes. Jem, even at his young age, is perceptive enough to see that even in the midst of the Great Depression, with the vast majority of people suffering in one way or another, there remains a tiered system of social and economic status. He and Scout and Atticus and many of their neighbours are ordinary, i.e. privileged enough to live a fairly regular life in a house with plenty of food and resources and everything, while other people are not so lucky. Atticus clarifies this for his kids when they ask him why the Cunninghams pay him with things like turnip greens and nuts and holly instead of money. Why does he pay you like that? I asked. Because that's the only way he can pay me. He has no money. Are we poor, Atticus? Atticus nodded. We are indeed. Jem's nose wrinkled. Are we as poor as the Cunninghams? Not exactly. The Cunninghams are country folks, farmers, and the crash hit them hardest. So these economic differences and the discrepancy in social standing between the different people and groups of people in Maycomb are revealed to us in 2 main ways. First, in how institutions like the law or education interact with these people, especially some of the poorer residents. And secondly, in the attitudes of individual characters. We see the institutional relationship to class very clearly on Scout's first day of school. We have this young, fairly naive and idealistic teacher, Miss Caroline, who seems to be completely oblivious to the material and economic realities of the community, or at least unaware that they extend to the children also. Scout observes, Miss Caroline seemed unaware that the ragged, denim-shirted and flour-sack-skirted first grade, most of whom had chopped cotton and fed hogs from the time they were able to walk, were immune to imaginative literature. Then Miss Caroline embarrasses one of the poorer children in the class, Walter Cunningham, when she asks him if he has anything to eat and tries to give him money. Scout then has to clarify things for Miss Caroline, even if her explanation goes unappreciated. That's okay, ma'am. You'll get to know all the country folks after a while. The Cunninghams never took anything they can't pay back. No church baskets and no scrip stamps. They never took anything off of anybody. They get along on what they have. They don't have much, but they get along on it. And then she adds, you're shaming him, Miss Caroline. A little later, Miss Caroline has a run-in with one of the Ewells, who insults her and leaves the class. One of the other students explains to her, he's one of the Ewells, ma'am. Whole school's full of them. They come first day every year and then leave. The truant lady gets them here, because she threatens them with the sheriff, but she's given up trying to hold them. She reckons she's carried out the law just getting their names on the roll and running them here the first day. You're supposed to mark them absent the rest of the year. So what we see is an institution attempting to enforce conformity in a community where the material realities and the priorities of the people make such attempts laughable. And this is something we continue to see in education, even if things have improved a lot. We still see kids who aren't suited to formal education in one way or another being forced into it, often more as a box-ticking exercise than an actual attempt at support or help, or an attempt to actually educate a child. Not to mention the fact that our entire education system is completely unfit for purpose, and that children shouldn't be subjected to 40-hour weeks sitting at desks learning mostly useless information in order to prepare them for lives as good little compliant office drones. But that's another conversation. So then let's look at some of the individual attitudes to class that we see. So obviously a lot of the more well-off or self-regarding members of the community display some pretty heinous racist attitudes throughout the novel. The women's church group is a particularly well-observed example. But they also have a few things to say about class and about families like the Cunninghams and the Ewells. Here is Scout describing how the Ewells lived, which is presumably information that she's picked up from the other townspeople. Maycomb's Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summertime were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the varmints that feasted on Maycomb's refuse. The varmints had a lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough cleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. And in that description you can hear the disdain that the ordinary people of Maycomb have for the Ewells. Then we have Aunt Alexandra, who talks a lot about the history of the Finch family. The esteem of their name and their providence and their position in the town are very important to her. Here she is talking about poor little Walter Cunningham when Scout suggests inviting him over. "Don't be silly, Jean Louise," said Aunt Alexandra. "The thing is, you can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines, you can put him in shoes and a new suit, but he'll never be like Jem. Besides, there's a drinking streak in that family a mile wide. Finch women aren't interested in that sort of people." And she goes on, "I'll tell you why. Because he is trash. That's why you can't play with him. I'll not have you around him, picking up his habits and learning Lord knows what." And to be fair to Scout, she completely rejects this view. She says of Walter, "No, everybody's got to learn. Nobody's born knowing. That Walter is as smart as he can be. He just gets held back sometimes because he has to stay out and help his daddy. Nothing's wrong with him." There is also that scene where a few drunk racists turn up at the jail looking for Tom, and they have a confrontation with Atticus. Scout sees that one of the men is Walter Cunningham's father, and she chats away to him about how nice his son is and everything, and about how they're in school together, and she basically shames them into leaving. Now, that scene is a bit twee and ridiculous, but it does show at least that Scout does not see class the way her aunt does. And I suppose it shows that the Cunninghams are used to being treated like trash, and that a little unexpected kindness and empathy can have a material impact. So when you look at all the class prejudice in the book, along with all the racial injustice, I suppose you could conclude that at the end of the day it's not really about income or colour. It's more about certain people having to feel superior to others, whether that's because of insecurity or resentment or some potential material gain for them or whatever. And that discrimination, that preying on the weak, that blaming of minorities, that sentiment of supremacy over other human beings is not something that is consigned to the past. Unfortunately, it's alive and well and even in the ascendant, and that's something we have to reckon with. Let's finish by talking about the law, justice and morality. And we'll look at these three things mostly by examining the character of Atticus Finch. At the start of the book, Scout tells us about Atticus getting his start as a lawyer. His first 2 clients were the last 2 persons hanged in the Maycomb County Jail. They were Haverfords. In Maycomb County, a name synonymous with jackass. They persisted in pleading not guilty, so there was nothing much Atticus could do for his clients except be present at their departure. An occasion that was probably the beginning of my father's profound distaste for the practice of criminal law. So his first distasteful experience in criminal justice is not the unfairness of the system, but the stupidity of his clients. And that is the attitude that Atticus stubbornly and earnestly and condescendingly insists on showing throughout the novel. A reverence and respect for the institution of the law that is entirely at odds with reality. Here's Atticus speaking to the jury at the close of the trial. "But there is one way in this country in which all men are created equal. There is one human institution that makes a pauper the equal of a Rockefeller, the stupid man the equal of an Einstein, and the ignorant man the equal of any college president. That institution, gentlemen, is a court. Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution. But in this country, our courts are the great levelers, and in our courts all men are created equal. I'm no idealist to believe firmly in the integrity of our courts and in the jury system. That is no ideal to me. It is a living, working reality. Gentlemen, a court is no better than each man of you sitting before me on this jury. A court is only as sound as its jury. And a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up." And here is Jem talking with Atticus about the unfairness of the verdict. "No, sir, they ought to do away with juries. He wasn't guilty in the first place, and they said he was. If you had been on that jury, son, and 11 other boys like you, Tom would be a free man," said Atticus. "So far, nothing in your life has interfered with your reasoning process. Those are 12 reasonable men in everyday life, Tom's jury. But you saw something come between them and reason. There's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They are ugly, but those are the facts of life. So Atticus sees a legal system that categorically does not produce justice, and yet he seems to consider it a more or less just system. Flawed, yes, but fundamentally fit for purpose. If only the people within it would act differently sometimes. But of course, a legal system in which a bunch of racist men, and it was only men at this time, can pronounce a clearly innocent man guilty is not fit for purpose. By definition. That is not a system that should be respected. It is not a system that needs minor improvements. It is a system that demands to be dismantled and replaced. Conservatives talk a lot about respect for law and order, but of course nobody should have any respect for an unjust institution that causes harm as opposed to protecting people from it. What people should respect is justice, but of course justice is all too rarely found as the product of law and order. So let's talk about morality and specifically Atticus's moral code. When he spoke to Jem, he said that the members of the jury were reasonable men. And this is one of the major problems I have with Atticus. He excuses the appalling views and behaviour of many of the residents of Maycomb and insists that they're good people, really. Atticus seems to forgive bigotry without ever dealing with it materially, without ever taking it into account. And this bigotry that Atticus refuses to acknowledge has material effects in the novel. It results in the death of an innocent man, among other things. And all of this fortune cookie wisdom that Atticus comes out with throughout the book is not just bland and superficial, but to my mind his views are also morally bankrupt. The idea that we shouldn't judge people for their racist opinions is incredibly dangerous, and it is categorically wrong and inexcusable. Of course we should judge people for that, and we should resist and challenge and push back on those views. Atticus insists on being nice to everyone, on seeing the good in everyone. He ignores the vicious, harmful, racist underbelly of the town, and that is not righteous or principled. It is weak and stupid and morally craven. Now, obviously we can't expect characters in a book to be perfect, but this is important because I feel like Lee is very clearly directing us to be in awe of Atticus's wisdom and his moral clarity. And this is where we see the simplistic morality of the book, which is essentially a kid's book at the end of the day, and how woefully insufficient that morality is when dealing with such heavy topics. This is summed up rather succinctly and hilariously when Scout asks Atticus if it's okay to hate Hitler, to which Atticus replies, "It is not. It's not okay to hate anybody," which is just the most ridiculous, inane, and self-defeating kind of moral absolutism. Kwame Ture has a nice line about love and hate being dialectical, that if you love your people, you should hate anyone who wants to bring them to harm. If Atticus preaches empathy and understanding and he wants to protect innocence, then this kind of inert pacifism isn't admirable, it isn't progressive. It's a cop-out. It's an acceptance of injustice and an invitation for the unjust to persist in their actions. Why wouldn't they, if there won't be any consequences? Holding Atticus Finch up as some kind of morally virtuous figure for this kind of cowardly acquiescence to racism is an insult to all of the activists who fought actively for civil rights. And it is from those radicals and revolutionaries that we should be seeking moral guidance on these issues. The correct way to meet injustice is not with Atticus's passive faith in the institution of the law, or in his magnanimous acceptance of small-town bigotry. Injustice must be met with resistance. That resistance may take the form of education. It could be legal or civil or societal reform, or it might be violent resistance. But it must be active, it must have power, it must seek to accomplish something. That is the only way to achieve justice, to go out and create it from injustice. Okay, that's it for To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like more content, you can check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. 50% of my videos are going up there at the moment, and that will increase in the future. I'll be back with another video soon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Good luck.